I remember the smell of the troop carrier's interior, recycled air, thick with the sweat of 3,000 bodies pressed together in the dark, the metallic tang of fear that no amount of ventilation could scrub away. We had been traveling for weeks, maybe months. Time loses meaning in the belly of a ship when the only clock is the rhythm of your own heartbeat and the grinding of distant engines that never stop, never rest, never show mercy. The lumen strips flickered in patterns that suggested malfunction, but were really just the ship's spirit, expressing its displeasure at carrying so much human cargo to a destination none of us could pronounce but all of us understood. A fortress world. The edge. The place where the Imperium's light grows thin and the darkness beyond presses close enough to taste. They told us we were fortunate. Commissar Helweg had stood before us in the mustering hall back on our hive world. I can barely remember its name now, just the grey Prometheum sky and the endless factorum blocks where I had worked before the tithe came calling, and he had spoken of duty and glory and the Emperor's eternal protection for those who served with valor. His voice had echoed off the corrugated metal walls, while servitors with empty eyes had processed our identification chips, tattoos burning the mark of our regiment into skin, still soft from civilian life. The commissar's uniform was immaculate, his face was hard, and his words were sharp as bayonets. "You are chosen," he had said, and we had believed him because we were young and stupid and still thought words like chosen meant something good. The ship lurched, and somewhere in the pressed mass of bodies a soldier vomited, adding another layer to the stench that had become our atmosphere. No one complained. Complaint was weakness, and weakness attracted attention, and attention on a troop carrier meant a visit from the ship's discipline, officers who maintained order with shock mauls and summary executions. I kept my eyes closed, my las rifle clutched to my chest, the metal cool through my standard-issue fatigues that were already stained with sweat and fear, and the grime of too many bodies in too small a space. My name was Jerek Tolvek, private in the 814th Huxian Infantry Regiment, and I was 19 years old. By the time this is over, by the time anyone finds these words, if they ever do, I will have become something else entirely. The descent through atmosphere came without warning, as these things always do in the Imperial Guard. One moment we were suspended in the relative stability of orbital drift. The next, the entire carrier shuddered and dropped, gravity reasserting itself with casual violence. Bodies slammed together, armor plating groaned, and the sound of retching multiplied through the compartment like a wave of human misery. Through the thick skin of the ship, I could hear something else, a distant rumbling that was not engines, not quite, something that spoke of artillery and explosions and war made manifest. The fortress world was speaking to us even before we set foot on its surface, telling us in the language of violence what awaited below. When the loading ramp finally dropped, the light hit us like a physical blow. After weeks of artificial twilight, the harsh white glare of the fortress world's sun was blinding, painful, purifying in the way that fire cleanses by destroying everything it touches. I stumbled forward with the rest of my squad, boots hitting rockcrete that was scarred with las burns and pocked with shell impacts, and for the first time I saw the world that would consume me. The landing field stretched in every direction, a vast plain of grey reinforced stone marked with the symbols of the administratum and the ecclesiarchy in paint that was fading, chipping, failing to maintain its grip on surfaces that had seen too much and endured too long. Beyond the field rose the fortress walls, massive structures of ferrocrete and plasteel that climbed toward the sky like the bastions of ancient cathedrals, bristling with defense batteries and void shield generators and the countless smaller weapons that gave the walls their killing edge. The smell was different here. Not the recycled air of the ship, but something rawer promethium exhaust from idling chimeras, the acrid bite of lasgun discharge that seemed to hang permanently in the atmosphere, the underlying scent of decay that came from bodies buried too shallow in soil that refused to properly accept the dead. And underneath it all, almost subliminal, the smell of incense from the shrine bunkers where priests led prayer shifts around the clock, burning sacred oils and reciting litanies that were supposed to strengthen our souls against what waited beyond the walls. I learned later that the fortress world consumed approximately 40,000 soldiers per month in its defense, a number that was both astronomical and completely inadequate to describe the reality of that consumption. Sergeant Karsk found us in the chaos of the landing field, his voice cutting through the din of arrival with the practiced authority of a man who had survived 3 tours on the line. He was older than I had expected. Most soldiers on fortress worlds don't live long enough to go grey, and his face was a map of scar tissue that told stories his mouth would never speak. "Form up, you worthless dregs," he shouted, and we formed up because the alternative was worse. "Welcome to the edge. Welcome to the wall. You're here because the Imperium needs bodies to throw at the dark, and you're those bodies. Glory, duty, honor, all that shit they told you back home. It's real. It's also completely fucking irrelevant to your survival. Stay low, follow orders, and maybe you'll last long enough to matter." We were assigned to the 3rd Defensive Ring, Section Gamma, Subsector 7 coordinates that meant nothing until we saw them, numbers that transformed into reality as we marched through the fortress complex. The interior of the walls was like walking through the intestines of some vast mechanical beast. Corridors of ferrocrete lit by harsh lumen strips that cast shadows deep enough to hide nightmares, doorways marked with high Gothic script, warning of ammunition stores and fuel depots and punishment cells. We passed other soldiers, men and women in fatigues that were bleached grey by sun and combat, their eyes tracking us with the empty assessment of veterans measuring fresh meat. No one spoke to us. No one offered advice or comfort or welcome. We were replacements, nothing more, filling slots in the line that had been emptied by shell fire and las burns and the 1,000 other ways that soldiers die on fortress worlds. Our barracks was a converted storage bunker, 30 meters below ground level, protected by 2 meters of ferrocrete and a blast door that required 4 men to operate. The interior was exactly what I should have expected, rows of metal cots welded to the floor, each marked with a serial number, each topped with a thin mattress that smelled of industrial solvent and previous occupants. Footlockers at the end of each cot held the sum total of a soldier's allowed possessions: 1 change of fatigues, basic hygiene supplies, any personal effects that fit in a space 40 centimeters by 20. The walls were bare ferrocrete, the floor was bare ferrocrete, the ceiling was bare ferrocrete, interrupted by conduits and pipes that dripped condensation in patterns that had stained the stone dark with moisture. A single shrine occupied 1 corner, a bronze aquila mounted on the wall above a stone basin filled with promethium that burned constantly, never extinguished, feeding on fuel piped directly from the fortress reserves. We were given 4 hours to settle in before our first rotation on the wall. I used the time to clean my lasrifle, check my power cells, and try to understand the map that Sergeant Karsk had provided, a schematic of our section that looked like the blueprint for a nightmare, showing firing positions and ammunition caches and evacuation routes that all seemed to lead nowhere good. The soldier on the cot next to mine was named Devrick, a tall man from a world I'd never heard of, and he spent the 4 hours sharpening his combat knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping of metal on stone, providing a counterpoint to the distant rumble of artillery that never quite stopped. When I asked him what to expect, he looked at me with eyes that were too old for his face and said, "Everything they told you is lies. The truth is worse. The wall itself was a revelation in Imperial engineering and human suffering combined into one massive structure. From the ground it had looked impressive, from the top it looked impossible, a killing field stretching toward a horizon, obscured by smoke and dust, and the haze of distance, broken terrain dotted with the ruins of previous attacks, trenches and craters, and the twisted metal skeletons of destroyed vehicles, forming a landscape of perpetual war. The firing position we occupied was a duracrete bunker set into the wall's crown, reinforced with armor plating, and equipped with heavy stubbers and a lascannon whose power cables snaked back into the wall's interior like technological umbilicals. Through the firing slit I could see for kilometers, and what I saw was desolation made manifest. The enemy came at irregular intervals, sometimes days apart, sometimes hours, and the terror was not knowing when. Between attacks we waited, watched, performed the rituals of maintenance and readiness that were supposed to keep us sharp but really just gave us something to do besides think about what was coming. The wall was never quiet. Artillery batteries fired harassment rounds into the wastes. Long-range Auspex arrays pinged constantly, searching for targets, and the Vox network crackled with reports from other sections, other squads, other soldiers performing the same grim calculus of survival. And always, underneath everything, the sound of the fortress itself. Generators humming, servitors shambling through maintenance tunnels, the distant clang of industry as foundries deep in the fortress core manufactured the ammunition we would use to hold the line for another day. My first contact with the enemy came at dawn on my third day on the wall, and I remember it with the crystal clarity that trauma provides. The warning sirens started as grey light was touching the eastern horizon, a sound that rose from the fortress's depths and climbed through the air like the wail of a dying beast. "Contact front," someone shouted Cask, I think, though in the chaos every voice sounded the same, and then we were at the firing positions. Lasguns braced, eyes straining to pierce the pre-dawn gloom. They came out of the smoke like ghosts. Figures moving through the wastes with purpose and discipline, too distant to make out details but close enough to represent death. The lascannon fired first, a brilliant lance of energy that carved through the darkness and found flesh. And then we were all firing, the harsh crack of lasguns overlapping into a continuous wall of sound. I killed my first enemy soldier that morning. I don't know his name. Don't know what he looked like beyond the shapes visible through my rifle's sight. Don't know if he had family or dreams or anything that made him more than a target. He fell when my last bolt took him in the chest, went down in that sudden, boneless way that marks real death as opposed to injury, and disappeared into the smoke. I felt nothing. That terrified me more than the combat itself, the absence of feeling, the mechanical efficiency with which I had ended a life. But there was no time for reflection because they kept coming, wave after wave emerging from the wastes, and we kept firing until the barrels of our lasguns were hot enough to raise blisters if you touched them with bare skin. The attack lasted for 3 hours. When it was over, the ground before our section was carpeted with bodies, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. It was impossible to count through the smoke and distance. Artillery crews would shell the corpses later to prevent disease, and servitor teams would venture out under cover of darkness to reclaim usable equipment. But for now they just lay there, testament to the fortress world's hunger. We had lost 2 soldiers from our section, a man named Pell who had taken shrapnel from a mortar round, and a woman named Teska who had simply stood up at the wrong moment and caught a last bolt through the throat. Their bodies were carried back to the lifts by servitors, tagged, processed, and scheduled for the mass crematorium that operated 24 hours a day beneath the fortress, feeding ashes to the waste recyclers that would transform their physical remains into something useful. Sleep came in brief intervals measured in hours, not nights, always in the barracks, always interrupted by alarms or training drills, or the simple inability to silence the mind's understanding of where you were and what you were doing. I dreamed of the hive world I'd left behind, of the factorum where I'd assembled components for equipment I'd never seen completed, of a girl named Serena who had worked the processing station next to mine and had smiled at me once, twice, 3 times before the tithe came. Those dreams felt more distant than the stars, separated from reality by a gulf wider than the void itself. The person who had known that life was gone, replaced by something harder, something shaped by the wall and the firing position, and the understanding that survival was measured in minutes and death was measured in certainty. The fortress world's routine became my routine. 6-hour shifts on the wall, followed by 6 hours of standby in the barracks, followed by 6 hours of maintenance and training, and the 1,000 other tasks that kept an Imperial Guard regiment functional. Eat when food was available, sleep when possible, pray according to the schedule posted on the barracks shrine. The Ministorum priests rotated through regularly, leading recitations of the Imperial Creed and the Litany of Protection, their voices rising and falling in patterns worn smooth by repetition. I learned to mouth the words without thinking, to let the prayers become background noise, something that marked time without requiring attention. The Emperor protects, they said. The Emperor provides. The Emperor watches over his faithful servants who stand between the Imperium and the dark. I wanted to believe them. Some days I almost did. Weeks became months, though the fortress world had no seasons to mark time's passage, just an endless cycle of grey days and darker nights punctuated by combat and casualty reports. The roster of our section changed constantly as soldiers were killed or wounded or went missing in ways that were never quite explained, but everyone understood. Fresh replacements arrived on the same kind of carriers that had brought us, young faces with eyes that still held hope and fear in equal measure, and we watched them with the same empty assessment that the veterans had given us. The fortress world consumed them quickly, some in their first engagement, others lasting weeks before the odds caught up with them. Each death was recorded, reported, filed away in some distant administratum archive, where our lives would be reduced to numbers in a ledger that balanced casualties against strategic objectives that we would never know. I learned the architecture of survival on the fortress world, the small practices that separated those who lasted from those who died. Keep your lasgun clean, check your power cells, know the evacuation routes, even though they mostly led to different ways of dying. Trust your squadmates, but don't get close, because closeness meant grief, and grief was a luxury you couldn't afford. Follow orders without hesitation, because hesitation meant death for everyone. Accept the fortress world's hunger as inevitable, not as a thing to be fought, but as a fact, like gravity or darkness, or the Emperor's distant light. The fortress world would take what it wanted. The only choice was how you faced that taking. The enemy changed over time. Or perhaps we just saw different aspects of the same enemy. Sometimes they came as organized units with coherent tactics and covering fire, soldiers as disciplined as our own, dying for causes as incomprehensible to us as ours probably were to them. Sometimes they came as mobs, screaming hordes that relied on weight of numbers and chemical courage, easier to kill, but somehow more terrifying in their mindless commitment to reaching the walls. And sometimes, increasingly, as the months wore on, they came as something else, figures that moved wrong or looked wrong or brought with them a sense of wrongness that made the air itself feel corrupted. Those attacks were the worst, not because they were more deadly, but because they whispered of things beyond death, possibilities that even the commissars couldn't entirely dismiss with their executions and their litanies. I was promoted to corporal after Devrick died. He had been on the wall for 7 months, longer than most, and he died stupidly, not in combat, but in a maintenance accident when a corroded support gave way and dropped a section of armor plating on him, crushing his chest before anyone could respond. There was no ceremony, no recognition of service beyond a brief mention in the daily casualty report. His body went to the crematorium. His possessions were redistributed. His slot in the roster was filled within hours. I inherited his position and his responsibilities, which meant leading a fire team of 4 soldiers, coordinating with Sergeant Kask, and carrying the weight of decisions that could mean life or death for people who trusted me to make them correctly. The promotion came with an extra ration chit per week and the authority to requisition special equipment from the armory. It did not come with answers to the questions that had started to fill my mind like poison. The Fortress World's command structure was Byzantine in its complexity, layers of authority that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify who actually made decisions. Above Kask was Lieutenant Morek, a career officer whose face I saw perhaps 3 times in as many months. Above Morek was Captain Somebody, and above the captain was a colonel whose name changed twice in the time I was there. Regimental command operated from deep within the fortress complex, protected by blast doors and security protocols, and the certainty that generals did not stand on walls where last bolts flew. The planetary governor was a figure of pure theory, a name invoked in official communications but never seen, never heard, possibly not even real. And above all of this, metaphorically and literally, stood the Fortress World's defense coordinator, a Lord General whose strategic genius, or incompetence, or simple existence, was a matter of rumor and speculation rather than confirmed fact. What I learned, slowly and painfully, was that the truth of the Fortress World had nothing to do with tactics or strategy or any of the things we'd been taught in training. The truth was simpler and more terrible. The Fortress World existed not to be held but to be held at, a buffer that absorbed attacks meant for more valuable systems deeper in the Imperium's heart. We were not winning the war on the Fortress World. We were participating in an equation of attrition where our lives were the currency being spent to purchase time measured in months or years or decades. The enemy could afford losses, because the dark could always breed more soldiers, more attackers, more nightmares to throw at the walls. The Imperium could afford losses because humanity bred fast and died faster, and there would always be more worlds to tithe for more bodies to feed, to more fortress worlds on more edges of more sectors stretching across the galaxy. We were expendable in the most literal sense, able to be expended, designed for expenditure, existing for no purpose beyond our eventual consumption. The realization came gradually, rather than in a single moment of clarity. It was there in the way officers spoke about casualty projections with the same tone they used to discuss ammunition requisitions. It was there in the administratum, reports that calculated acceptable loss rates as percentages rather than people. It was there in the medical facilities that focused on keeping soldiers functional rather than healthy, returning the wounded to duty with scars and augmetics and unhealed injuries because healing took time the Fortress World wouldn't provide. It was there in the crematorium smoke that rose constantly from the fortress's depths, a pillar of human ash that was visible for kilometers and served as both warning and promise. This is how all things end on the Fortress World. Winter came, though on the Fortress World that just meant the temperature dropped from unbearable to merely miserable, and the rain fell with increased frequency, turning the wastes into a morass of mud that made attacks more difficult but not impossible. We received new equipment, better armor, updated lasguns, a handful of plasma weapons that required special training to operate without killing the operator. The improvements made no difference to the fundamental equation. Soldiers still died at the same rate, their better-equipped corpses feeding the same crematorium, their names appearing on the same casualty reports that disappeared into the same administratum archives where everything important was recorded and nothing important was remembered. I turned 20 on the Fortress World, though I only realized it weeks later when I was reviewing my identification documents for some forgotten administrative purpose. 20 years old, and I felt ancient not in body, though the Fortress World was aging that too, but in spirit, in the part of consciousness that holds hope and dreams, and the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. That part of me was dead, had died so gradually that I hadn't noticed its passing, replaced by something harder and colder and infinitely more suited to survival. I mentioned my birthday to no one. There was nothing to celebrate, and no one who would have cared. The fortress world's true horror wasn't the combat, or the casualties, or even the grinding certainty of eventual death. The true horror was the way it normalized, that death made it routine, transformed the most profound human experience into administrative procedure. When Trooper Hesk died, shot through both legs by a heavy stubber during a pre-dawn raid, and bled out before the medics could reach him, his death was notable only because he screamed for his mother with his last breath, and some of us were close enough to hear. When Corporal Bennick died, caught by artillery fire that left nothing identifiable enough to cremate his death, was notable only because it created an opening in the duty roster. When Sergeant Kask died, and he did die, eventually, because everyone dies on Fortress Worlds, his death was notable only because it meant I was promoted to his position, given his responsibilities and his burdens, and his certainty that none of this mattered, because the fortress world would eat us all regardless. As sergeant, I had access to information that corporals and privates never saw, briefings that provided context for the violence we lived through. I learned that the fortress world was one of 17 in the sector, all of them locked in similar struggles against similar enemies, all of them consuming soldiers at similar rates. I learned that resupply came every 90 days, weather permitting, and that weather permitting was a euphemism for, unless the enemy's fleet presence makes it impossible. I learned that the fortress world had been under siege for 43 years, that its defenders had been replaced approximately 17 times over in that period, and that strategic doctrine suggested it could remain defensible for another 50 years assuming steady reinforcement. I learned that assuming steady reinforcement was a bold assumption given the Imperium's infinite demands and finite resources. But most importantly, I learned that everything we were doing, the combat, the casualties, the grinding horror of daily survival, was considered within acceptable parameters by the strategic planners who would never set foot on the fortress world. Our losses were acceptable. Our suffering was acceptable. Our transformation from human beings into worn-out parts in an enormous killing machine was acceptable. The fortress world was performing its function exactly as designed, and the fact that this function required our consumption was unfortunate, but necessary and ultimately irrelevant to anyone who mattered. We were doing our duty. The Emperor protects. The Imperium endures. Individual lives. Individual deaths, individual anything. All of it disappeared into the vast calculus of galactic warfare, where the only numbers that mattered were measured in billions, and the only time frame that mattered was measured in millennia. The fortress world changed me in ways I'm still discovering, transforming not just behavior, but the fundamental architecture of consciousness. I stopped dreaming. Or rather, the dreams that came were so dark and fragmentary that waking provided no relief from sleeping. I stopped caring about news from elsewhere in the Imperium, stopped tracking victories or defeats, or the movements of fleets and forces that operated in a realm of strategy so far above my reality that they might as well have been stories about different species on different worlds, in different worlds, galaxies. I stopped asking questions that had no useful answers. Why are we here? Who are we fighting? What are we defending? When will this end? The fortress world had no use for such questions. The fortress world had use only for bodies that could point lasguns and pull triggers and absorb enemy fire and die in ways that accumulated into statistics that someone somewhere might use to justify something. I watched my squad rotate through its roster like water through a sieve. Faces appeared, learned their duties, died or broke or went missing, were replaced by new faces that would follow the same trajectory. I learned to assess new soldiers with the cold efficiency of a butcher, evaluating livestock. This one will last a month. This one will break in a week. This one has the dead-eyed stare that marks soldiers who are already gone, just waiting for reality to catch up. I learned to give orders with the certainty that some of those orders would result in deaths, and to accept that outcome as the necessary price of maintaining the line. I learned to file casualty reports with the same attention to detail I gave to ammunition requisitions, because in the fortress world's bureaucracy, both were equally important and equally meaningless. The enemy's nature became clearer as time passed, though clarity brought no comfort. They were not a unified force, but a roiling chaos of factions that sometimes fought us, sometimes fought each other, and sometimes seemed to fight reality itself. We faced cultists who screamed prayers to absent gods, soldiers who wore uniforms that might have been Imperial decades or centuries ago, things that had once been human but had been transformed into something else through means that the commissars forbade us to speculate about. Behind them all, always implied but never directly referenced, was the fundamental wrongness that gave the fortress world its purpose, the presence beyond the edge that the fortress walls held back, not through strength, but through the simple arithmetic of sacrifice. The fortress world's command gave us a new objective during my 8th month on the wall. Intelligence such as it was suggested that a major enemy offensive was being prepared, a push that would attempt to breach the 3rd defensive ring and penetrate into the fortress interior. Our section was tasked with forward reconnaissance, scouting beyond the walls to identify enemy staging areas and troop concentrations. It was a suicide mission dressed up as tactical necessity, and everyone understood this because suicide missions were the fortress world's specialty. I selected 5 soldiers for the patrol, choosing those whose faces had begun to haunt my dreams because they were already dead just walking around waiting for it, and led them through the postern gate into the wastes at midnight, when darkness might provide cover, or might just make our deaths invisible to those who would rather not see. The wastes beyond the walls were worse than I had imagined, and I had spent months imagining them. The ground was treacherous with craters and trenches, and the half-buried detritus of previous battles, every step a gamble that the earth beneath would hold. The air tasted of chemicals and decay, and the darkness was thick with smoke and the dust of pulverized rockcrete. We moved in single file, weapons ready, every sense straining for threats that could come from any direction. Behind us, the fortress wall rose like a cliff face, its crown marked by lights that guttered and sparked, and ahead the wastes stretched into blackness that seemed absolute. We were 6 men outside the Emperor's light, and the darkness knew it. We found the enemy staging area 3 hours into the patrol, hidden in a ravine that had been carved by some ancient geological process, and was now home to tents and equipment and sleeping soldiers. From our position on the ravine's edge we could see everything: the layout of defenses, the positioning of heavy weapons, the movement of sentries, all the intelligence that command required. I used my vox bead to transmit the coordinates, whispered into a device that crackled with static and distance, and received confirmation that artillery batteries were being targeted. Our mission was complete. All that remained was the return journey. We didn't make it back. The artillery strike came early, a miscalculation or miscommunication or simple Imperial efficiency that valued destroying the target over extracting the scouts who had found it. The first shells landed as we were crossing open ground, and the world exploded into fire and shrapnel and concussive force that picked us up and threw us like toys. I remember hitting the ground hard enough to crack ribs, remember the taste of blood and dirt, remember crawling through the smoke looking for my squad and finding pieces instead of people. 3 were dead instantly, torn apart by the barrage. 1 was dying slowly, gut shot by shrapnel, screaming for help I couldn't provide. The last was missing, simply gone, disappeared into the chaos with no evidence of what had happened beyond the absence. I was found by a recovery team 6 hours later, pulled from a shell crater where I'd crawled to wait for death or rescue, whichever came first. They carried me back to the fortress, through the postern gate that sealed behind us with the finality of a tomb closing, and delivered me to the medical facilities where exhausted medics performed triage with the cold efficiency of people who had seen too much suffering to be moved by individual cases. Broken ribs, concussion, lacerations, burns, nothing critical, nothing that would prevent my return to duty within days. The fact that I was the only survivor of my patrol was noted in the mission report and forgotten immediately. The fact that my squad had been killed by our own artillery was mentioned nowhere, because such facts were inconvenient to the narrative of Imperial competence. I was back on the wall within a week, promoted to staff sergeant because the fortress world's hunger had consumed my superiors, and nature abhors a vacuum even in military hierarchies. With the promotion came access to even more information, briefings that revealed the fortress world's situation with increasingly stark clarity. The major offensive that we had scouted was one of 7 being prepared simultaneously across the defensive perimeter. The enemy's numbers were estimated in the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. The fortress world's garrison was approximately 90,000 combat-effective soldiers, supported by armor and artillery and the defense installations built into the walls themselves. The mathematics were simple and brutal. We could not win, could not hold, could not survive if the enemy committed to a full-scale assault. The only question was how long we could delay the inevitable and how many of them we could kill before they killed us. The offensive began at dawn on a day that would have been beautiful if not for everything else. The sky was clear. The sun was rising with the same indifferent majesty it had shown every morning since the fortress world first formed, and for just a moment, before the sirens started, I felt something like peace. Then reality reasserted itself in the form of alarms and vox traffic and the distinct rumble of artillery fire from multiple directions simultaneously. I reached my position on the wall just as the first enemy waves became visible. Masses of figures emerging from the wastes, moving with terrible purpose toward walls that suddenly seemed very thin. The lascannon fired, then the heavy stubbers, then every weapon on the wall opened up in a continuous roar of defensive fire that was deafening and impressive, and ultimately inadequate. They came in waves that broke against the walls like an ocean against cliffs, each wave diminished by our fire, but succeeded by another and another and another. We killed them in numbers that should have mattered but didn't, las bolts and explosive shells and artillery fire carving holes in their formations that filled immediately with more bodies. The enemy's casualties were obscene, thousands dying in the first hour alone, but they kept coming because death meant nothing to them or their commanders or the dark powers that sent them. We fought for 12 hours straight, reloading and firing until our weapons were hot enough to burn skin, until power cells were depleted and had to be replaced with increasingly shaky hands, until the fortress world's reality reduced to the simplest possible equation. See target, fire weapon, kill if possible, repeat until death. The enemy breached the wall in 3 places that first day, fighting their way through gaps created by concentrated artillery fire and explosive charges that pulverized ferrocrete that had stood for decades. Each breach became a desperate killing ground, where squads fought hand-to-hand with bayonets and combat knives and improvised weapons, where the fortress world's hunger fed on both sides without discrimination. We closed 2 breaches by piling bodies so high that they formed barriers, then holding those barriers against everything the enemy could throw at us. The 3rd breach held for 4 hours before a company of stormtroopers counterattacked from the fortress interior, elite soldiers in better armor with better weapons buying with their deaths what we couldn't achieve with ours. Night brought no respite, just a different kind of combat, where darkness became a weapon both sides used. The enemy infiltrated through the wastes, setting up firing positions that harassed our defenses, launching small raids designed to probe for weaknesses or simply to wear us down. We responded with searchlights and flares and heavy weapons fire that illuminated sections of the battlefield in harsh white light that revealed horrors we would have preferred not to see. The corpses were piling up, thousands upon thousands of them, creating a landscape of death that extended for hundreds of meters from the wall, and the smell was indescribable, rot and blood, and the sweet, sick stench of bodies decomposing in the heat and chemical taint of weapons fire. The offensive continued for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of constant combat that eroded not just our numbers, but our fundamental capacity for human experience. Sleep became brief periods of unconsciousness stolen between shifts, never deep enough to provide rest, always interrupted by alarms or nightmares, or the simple inability to silence consciousness. Food became fuel, tasteless ration blocks that provided calories without satisfaction, eaten mechanically while standing at firing positions because sitting down meant risking the inability to stand up again. Conversation became terse exchanges of necessary information, ammunition count, casualty status, enemy positions, nothing personal, nothing that required the energy of human connection. I watched my soldiers become something less than human, or perhaps something more, stripped of everything except the core capacity for violence and survival. They stopped responding to their names, answered only to rank or function. They stopped showing pain when injured, treating wounds with the same detachment they showed cleaning their weapons. They stopped asking questions about the battle's progress or the enemy's numbers, or when relief would come, because those questions had answers that were worse than not knowing. They became extensions of the fortress wall itself, biological components in a defensive system that would keep functioning until physical destruction made further function impossible. The fortress world's command threw everything into the defense. Reserve units pulled from training, support personnel issued combat weapons and sent to the walls, servitors reprogrammed for combat roles they were never designed for. The crematorium operated beyond capacity, burning bodies around the clock and still falling behind, until mass graves had to be dug in the fortress interior and filled with soldiers who deserved better but received only this. The medical facilities overflowed, corridors lined with wounded, waiting for treatment that would come too late, or not at all, medics making brutal decisions about who could be saved and who would be given mercy and who would be left to die slowly because there were no resources for anything else. The enemy eventually withdrew, not because we defeated them, but because they had achieved whatever objective they were pursuing, or lost interest, or received new orders, or any of a dozen other possibilities that we would never know. One morning the assault simply stopped. The wastes emptied of attacking forces, and we were left staring at a battlefield covered in bodies and burned equipment, and the shattered hopes of everyone who had thought the fortress world might hold. We had survived, technically, though survival is a strange word to describe the state we were in. The fortress walls still stood, though breached in multiple places. The defensive batteries still fired, though with depleted ammunition. The soldiers still manned their positions, though there were so many fewer of them now. The casualty reports took days to compile. 23,000 dead, 8,000 wounded, seriously enough to require evacuation. 4,000 missing, presumed dead. We had lost more than a third of the fortress world's garrison in 3 weeks of fighting. Reinforcements were requested, prioritized, approved, through bureaucratic channels that moved with glacial speed, while we held walls with squads that were half strength and tired past the point of functionality. New soldiers would arrive eventually, fresh faces with intact hopes, and the cycle would begin again. The fortress world would consume them as it had consumed us, as it would consume whoever came after them. World without end. Amen. I was promoted to lieutenant in the aftermath, given command of a full platoon, because most of the previous officer corps was dead or broken, or had been evacuated for injuries that made them useless to the fortress world's needs. The promotion came with quarters in the officer barracks, a private room, barely larger than a storage closet, with a real bed and a door that locked, and a small desk where I could sit and complete the endless paperwork that warfare generates. It also came with the knowledge that I was now responsible for approximately 100 soldiers, that my decisions would directly affect their survival, and that most of them would die regardless of what I decided, because the fortress world demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice required victims. I tried to maintain some semblance of humanity for my soldiers, organizing the platoon to maximize rest periods, ensuring equitable distribution of supplies, enforcing the small disciplines of military life that provided structure when everything else was chaos. I learned their names, all of them, and tried to use those names instead of just rank and serial number. I wrote letters of condolence to the families of soldiers who died under my command, knowing the letters would take months to reach their destinations, and might not reach them at all, because the Imperium's postal service prioritized strategic communications over personal grief. I conducted prayer services on the platoon shrine, reciting litanies I had memorized without believing, because the soldiers needed the comfort of ritual, even if that comfort was false. The fortress world's rhythm resumed after the offensive. The familiar cycle of patrols and maintenance, and combat in measured doses, rather than constant assault. But something had changed. Some fundamental shift in how we understood our situation. Before the offensive, there had been an unspoken belief that the fortress world could be held indefinitely, that we were part of a permanent defensive installation rather than a temporary delay. After the offensive, that belief was gone, replaced by the certain knowledge that we were dying by degrees, that every engagement diminished us faster than reinforcements could replenish, that the mathematics of attrition would eventually produce an equation that could only end one way. I began to understand why the fortress world broke soldiers in specific ways. It wasn't the combat itself, brutal as that was, but the complete absence of hope that came from truly comprehending the situation. We weren't fighting to win because winning was impossible. We weren't fighting for victory because victory was meaningless in a war that measured timeframes in decades and counted casualties in millions. We were fighting because the Imperium required the fortress world to continue fighting, because somewhere far away in rooms we would never see, people we would never meet, had decided that our deaths served purposes we would never understand, and because refusing to fight meant execution by commissar, which was at least faster than death by combat but no less certain. Some soldiers broke openly, lost the capacity for military function, and were dealt with according to regulations that were harsh but clear. Others broke internally, maintained the appearance of compliance, while everything that made them individuals rotted away, became animate corpses that still passed for living, because the alternative was acknowledging what they had become. I watched myself becoming one of the latter, felt the erosion of whatever spark made Jarek Tolvek a person rather than just a military rank and serial number. The things I had cared about, memories of home, dreams of survival, basic human connections, all of it was fading like color bleached by harsh sunlight, leaving behind only the gray substrate of existence without meaning. The fortress world celebrated the Emperor's Day with formal ceremonies that seemed obscene given our circumstances. Officers in their best uniforms, priests in ceremonial vestments, soldiers formed into parade units that marched through the fortress interior while recorded hymns played from crackling voxcasters. The planetary governor's representative, a pale bureaucrat who had never seen the walls, read a proclamation praising our devotion and sacrifice, words carefully chosen to acknowledge our suffering, while categorizing it as glorious and necessary, and ultimately meaningless, beyond its contribution to the Imperium's eternal glory. We stood at attention through the ceremony, thousands of us, and not one face showed anything except empty endurance. After the ceremony, I returned to my quarters and tried to remember the person I had been before the fortress world. The memories were there but distant, like stories someone had told me about a stranger. I remembered the factory where I'd worked, the rhythm of assembly line production, the satisfaction of completing my shift and returning to the hab block where I'd lived. I remembered Serena, though I couldn't quite recall her face anymore, just the impression of kindness in a place that wasn't kind. I remembered believing that life had purpose and future and possibility. Those memories were artifacts from another existence, proof that I had once been something other than what the fortress world had made me. Time on the fortress world became increasingly non-linear, days blending together into an undifferentiated mass of duty and combat and survival. I stopped marking the calendar, stopped trying to track how long I'd been posted to this world, because the numbers were just numbers and meant nothing beyond the abstract fact of duration. Soldiers came and went, their names and faces merging into a collective blur of humanity consumed and replaced. The wall stood, or parts of it stood, while other parts fell and were rebuilt. And we defended it, because that's what we were ordered to do, and because there was nothing else. I was 21 years old, though I had to check my records to confirm that, and I felt ancient. My body was still functional, despite accumulated scars and chronic pain from injuries that had healed poorly. My mind was still capable of tactical assessment and command decisions, and all the cognitive tasks that warfare requires. But something essential was gone, burned away by the fortress world's heat, or frozen in its dark moments, or simply worn away by constant friction between hope and reality. I was becoming the thing the fortress world needed, a machine that could process violence and produce orders and maintain the fiction of military effectiveness, while everything beneath that surface crumbled. The enemy adapted their tactics after the failed offensive, shifted from direct assault to siege operations, designed to grind us down through attrition rather than overwhelming force. They established positions in the wastes beyond our weapons' effective range, fired artillery that harassed our defenses without offering targets we could meaningfully retaliate against, launched raids designed more to wear us psychologically than to achieve tactical objectives. It was warfare as psychological erosion, and it was effective in ways that direct combat couldn't match. We could fight soldiers, could point our weapons and fire, and achieve some measurable result. We couldn't fight the grinding pressure of constant low-level threat, couldn't defend against our own exhaustion, couldn't hold walls that were collapsing from within faster than enemy action could breach them from without. The fortress world's infrastructure began failing in ways that reflected our own deterioration. Water systems developed leaks that maintenance crews couldn't fully repair, leading to rationing that made an already miserable existence more so. Power generation became unreliable, forcing schedules that worked around brownouts and blackouts rather than functioning on demand. The Vox network developed increasing problems, communications becoming garbled or dropping entirely at critical moments. The fortress was aging, dying by degrees just like its defenders, both ground down by the same relentless pressure that gave no respite and allowed no recovery. I received orders for a command-level briefing, my first since the offensive, and traveled deep into the fortress interior to rooms I'd never seen. The briefing room was larger than my entire platoon's quarters, walls covered with tactical displays and strategic maps that showed the fortress world's position in a sector-wide defensive network that was clearly failing. The senior officers present looked no better than frontline soldiers, gray-faced, exhausted, carrying the weight of decisions that had no good options, only varying degrees of bad ones. The briefing itself was brief and brutal. Enemy forces were massing for another major offensive, possibly larger than the previous one, and reinforcements would not arrive before the assault began. We would hold with what we had or we would fall. The Emperor protects. Dismissed. I returned to my platoon and tried to frame the situation in terms that wouldn't completely destroy morale, knowing that morale was already so damaged that further destruction might not matter. We would face another assault. We would do our duty. We would trust in the Emperor and our training and the strength of the walls. Every word felt hollow, meaningless sounds that pretended structure existed where there was only chaos. But the words were necessary because the alternative was silence, and silence would have been an admission that we all understood. This was the end, or at least the beginning of the end, and nothing we did would change that fundamental trajectory. The fortress world gave us 3 weeks to prepare, 3 weeks that felt simultaneously too long and desperately short. We reinforced positions that had been weakened during the previous offensive, stockpiled ammunition and supplies, rehearsed defensive procedures that everyone already knew but practicing gave the illusion of control. The fortress's manufactorums worked around the clock, producing the material of warfare shells and power cells, and replacement parts for weapons that were wearing out faster than they could be maintained. The crematorium continued burning bodies because soldiers kept dying even without major combat, ground down by disease and accidents, and the 1,000 casual ways that the fortress world killed those who served it. I wrote a letter during those 3 weeks, addressed to no one because I had no one to address it to, just words on paper that documented what I'd experienced and seen and become. Not a report; those were filed regularly according to regulations, but a confession, an attempt to translate the fortress world's reality into language that might make sense to someone who had never experienced it. I described the combat and the casualties, the grinding fear and exhausted numbness, the way the fortress world consumed soldiers, not through dramatic violence, but through relentless erosion of everything that made life worth living. I described my own transformation, the death of the person I'd been, and the emergence of something else, something harder and colder and infinitely less human. I sealed the letter and stored it in my footlocker with instructions that it should be forwarded to the administratum archives if I died, knowing it would probably be lost or destroyed or simply filed away unread, but needing to create it anyway because creating it was the last act of defiance I could manage. The second major offensive began exactly when intelligence predicted it would, which should have been comforting but somehow made it worse. The enemy's attack was better coordinated than before, hitting multiple sections simultaneously with forces that seemed endless. The first hour went badly, the second hour went worse, and by the third hour, sections of the wall were in danger of being completely overrun. I fought alongside my platoon, abandoned the pretense of command in favor of simple presence in the firing line, because officers who stayed in bunkers while their soldiers died were worse than useless. We held our section through some combination of tactics and luck, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to yield. But I could see other sections failing, could hear the Vox traffic reporting breaches and casualties, and desperate requests for reinforcements that couldn't be provided. The enemy poured through the breaches like water through broken dam, flooding into the fortress interior, where combat became a nightmare of close quarters, fighting in corridors and bunkers and installations never designed for internal defense. I led my platoon into the breach fights, moving through sections of the fortress that were transformed into killing grounds, stepping over bodies of soldiers and enemies mixed together in death's democracy. We fought room by room, corridor by corridor, buying time that might let other units establish fallback positions or might just delay the inevitable by minutes. My platoon was down to 30 soldiers, then 20, then 12, the fortress world consuming them with accelerating hunger as the battle intensified. I don't remember getting wounded, just the sudden awareness that I was on the ground and couldn't stand, that something was wrong with my leg in ways that my numbed brain couldn't quite process. Blood was spreading across the ferrocrete in patterns that seemed important, and sound had gone strange and distant, and someone was screaming, but I couldn't tell if it was me or someone else. Hands grabbed me, dragged me backward through corridors that had filled with smoke, and I caught fragmentary images of ongoing combat soldiers firing point-blank into enemy soldiers, both sides reduced to pure animal violence without strategy or tactics beyond kill or be killed. The medical facility was chaos, every bed filled, wounded stacked in corridors waiting for treatment that many wouldn't receive. A medic examined my leg with hands that were shaking from exhaustion, gave me an injector of painkillers that dulled the worst of the agony, but left enough for me to understand how badly damaged I was. Shrapnel had torn through muscle and possibly bone, and field surgery, under these conditions, meant amputation followed by basic augmetic replacement, or slow death from infection. I chose amputation because the alternative was unthinkable, and I chose it knowing that augmetic legs made you too valuable to waste, that recovered soldiers were returned to duty because the fortress world needed bodies more than it cared about those bodies' integrity. The surgery happened in a room that was operating theater and abattoir combined, medics working with assembly line efficiency on soldiers whose bodies were raw materials to be processed. I remember the bite of the surgical saw, the distinct smell of cauterization, the distant understanding that the leg they were cutting off had carried me through thousands of kilometers of patrol and combat, and was now just waste to be disposed of. I remember looking at other soldiers waiting for similar procedures and seeing in their faces the same empty acceptance, the same understanding that this was just another form of the fortress world's consumption, not death, but transformation into something less than what we'd been. Recovery was measured in days because the fortress world couldn't afford longer, and recovery meant learning to walk on an augmetic leg that connected to nerve clusters with crude efficiency and sent signals that were close enough to normal sensation for military purposes. The augmetic was Imperial standard issue, ferrous alloy and synthetic muscle wrapped in plasteel housing that would never quite feel like real flesh, but would function adequately for decades if properly maintained. I learned to walk again, to run, to brace against weapons recoil, all the physical tasks that military service required. What I couldn't learn was how to ignore what the augmetic represented: permanent physical proof that the fortress world had claimed parts of me, that I would carry its mark even if I somehow survived to leave. I returned to duty before the battle was fully resolved, because the fortress world's needs overrode medical recommendations and common sense. My platoon was down to 7 soldiers, remnants of a unit that had started at 100, and those 7 looked at me with eyes that reflected the same knowledge I felt. We were all corpses just waiting for the killing blow. The only question was when and how. We returned to our section of the wall, found it scorched and pocked with weapons impacts but still standing, and resumed our positions because that's what soldiers do. The second offensive eventually broke, same as the first, enemy forces withdrawing after achieving whatever purposes they served. The casualty reports were even worse this time: 34,000 dead, 11,000 wounded, 6,000 missing. The fortress world had lost nearly half its garrison in 2 major offensives over 6 months. Reinforcements were coming, priority transit from multiple hive worlds, but they would take months to arrive, and the enemy clearly understood this, because they were visible in the wastes, massing for what could only be a third assault, designed to break the fortress world completely before those reinforcements could tip the balance. I was promoted to captain because everyone above me was dead, given command of a company that existed more on paper than in reality, since most of its units were below half strength. The promotion came with access to fortress-level strategic planning, briefings where senior officers spoke frankly about the situation because there was no point in pretending anymore. The fortress world was failing. The defenses were compromised beyond what could be repaired with available resources. The garrison was exhausted beyond what could be restored with rest or rotation or any conventional military solution. The enemy's third offensive, when it came, would probably succeed in breaching the inner defensive rings, possibly penetrate to the fortress core, certainly result in casualties that would make the previous battles look mild by comparison. But the fortress world would hold anyway. Not because we could defeat the enemy, but because the Imperium required it to hold, because somewhere in the vast machinery of Imperial strategy, this world's sacrifice bought time or resources or advantages for other worlds and other wars. We would fight until we couldn't fight, hold until we couldn't hold, die in numbers that would be recorded as statistics in reports that no one important would ever read. The fortress world would consume us completely, grind us down to ash and memory and bureaucratic notation, and then it would consume the next garrison, and the next, world without end. Emperor eternal. Amen. I stand on the wall now, looking out at wastes that are thick with enemies preparing for another assault, and I understand with perfect clarity what I've become. Not a soldier. Soldiers fight with hope of victory or at least survival, but a resource being expended according to plans made by people who don't know my name and wouldn't care if they did. The fortress world has consumed everything that made me Jarek Tolvek, left behind only Captain Tolvek, Company Commander, Service Number 814HU73291, a military rank and identification number that will appear on casualty reports alongside thousands of others when this final battle concludes. The augmetic leg aches in ways that real flesh never did. Phantom pain that might be nerve damage or might just be memory of what was lost. My Lazariful is clean and functional. Power cells are charged. Combat knife is sharp. All the physical tools of warfare maintained with the discipline that becomes automatic after enough repetition. My soldiers are ready as anyone can be ready for what's coming, positioned at their firing points, weapons loaded, prayers recited, last letters written and stored in footlockers that will probably be destroyed when the fortress falls. We are prepared to do our duty one final time. The sirens are starting now, rising from the fortress depths with their familiar wail, and I can see movement in the wastes as the enemy begins their advance. This is how it ends, how it was always going to end, with me standing on a fortress wall on a world whose name I can barely remember anymore, fighting enemies whose cause I don't understand, serving purposes I was never meant to know. The fortress world will consume me today or tomorrow or the day after, will add my body to the mountain of corpses that its defense requires, will transform my life into numbers in reports that document its strategic value, while erasing my individual existence. I raise my Lazariful and sight on targets that are already in range, waiting for the order to fire that will come in seconds, and I feel nothing. Not fear, not anger, not even the grim satisfaction of defiance, just empty acceptance of the fortress world's hunger and my place in feeding it. The Emperor protects, they say, and maybe that's true in some abstract theological sense, but here on the wall, the only protection is the strength of your own arms and the accuracy of your weapon and the willingness to die doing your duty, because the alternative is dying as a coward, and the difference matters even if no one remembers. The order comes, I fire. The fortress world continues its endless consumption. This is what happens when you're posted to the edge. You learn that duty and despair are the same thing, that survival is just a slower form of dying, that the Imperium's glory is built on graves so numerous that they form continents, and that your individual life means nothing except as a single digit in the vast equation of galactic warfare. I am 21 years old, and I will never be anything else. The fortress world has seen to that. The battle unfolds around me with the familiar choreography of violence. Enemy forces surging forward in waves that break against our defensive fire. I kill and kill and kill. Each trigger pull another death added to the uncountable total. Each enemy soldier falling just another body to join the millions who have died on this world over decades of siege. My company holds its position through the first hour, then the second, diminishing with each passing minute as casualties mount. Soldiers fall around me, some screaming, some silent, all becoming equally dead, and I step over their bodies to maintain the firing line because that's what the fortress world demands and what I exist to provide. The third breach of the wall comes at hour 4, a massive explosion that tears through ferrocrete like paper and opens a gap wide enough for vehicles. Enemy armor pours through rusted machines that belch black smoke, and bristle with weapons that were outdated a century ago, but kill just as efficiently as modern equivalents. We redirect fire toward the breach, las cannons and missile launchers, and every heavy weapon within range concentrating on the vehicles, and we destroy them one by one, but not before they've delivered their cargo of soldiers deep into our defensive perimeter. Fighting spills into the fortress interior again, the same nightmare corridors and bunkers transformed into killing grounds, and I lead what remains of my company into the breach, because that's where commanders are supposed to be. We meet the enemy in hand-to-hand combat, where lasguns become clubs and combat knives become the primary weapons, where the veneer of civilization strips away and warfare becomes what it's always been, murder-made, systematic and sanctioned by authority. I kill a man with my knife, feel the blade slide between his ribs and pierce something vital, watch his eyes go empty as life drains out. He looks young, maybe younger than I was when I arrived on the fortress world, and I feel nothing. The fortress world has burned that capacity out of me. The battle continues for 6 hours, then 12, then 24, time losing meaning in the continuous cycle of combat and brief respite and more combat. Sleep becomes impossible. Food becomes something you force down during seconds-long pauses, and reality contracts to the immediate moment of survival. My company is gone, reduced to scattered individuals fighting in isolation because unit cohesion has broken down completely. I find myself alone in a corridor filled with bodies, stepping over corpses that might be friendly or might be enemy because in death they all look the same, broken meat that was once human, now just obstacles to navigate around. I encounter other soldiers, form ad hoc squads that last minutes before casualties or chaos separates us again, fight alongside people whose names I never learn because names don't matter when you're all going to die anyway. We hold sections of corridor, lose them, retake them, lose them again, endless cycles of advance and retreat that achieve nothing except accumulating more bodies. The fortress world feeds on us without preference, consuming defenders and attackers with equal appetite, and we participate in that consumption because the alternative is surrender, and surrender means something worse than death. On the third day of continuous combat, I find myself back at my original position on the wall, or what remains of it. The fortifications are shattered, the firing positions are destroyed, and the bodies are stacked so thick that they form barriers higher than the original wall. I climb over corpses to reach a still functional heavy stubber, check its ammunition feed, and resume firing into enemy formations that are still advancing, despite losses that should have broken any rational force. They come and we kill them, and they keep coming, and I understand with absolute clarity that this is the endgame, not a battle to be won but the final consumption, the fortress world feeding one last time before it dies. The enemy reaches the wall in overwhelming numbers, scrambling over their own dead to reach our positions, and the fighting becomes purely instinctive. Shoot, reload, shoot, stab when they get close, use anything as a weapon when organized resistance becomes impossible. I'm hit multiple times, las burns and shrapnel that should be incapacitating, but adrenaline and augmetics keep me functional. Blood runs down my side from a wound I haven't had time to examine, and my vision is starting to narrow in ways that suggest significant blood loss. But the firing never stops because stopping means dying, and I'm not ready to die yet. Not because I want to live, but because dying means the fortress world wins completely. A shell lands close enough to throw me backwards, concussive force lifting me and slamming me into ferrocrete that cracks under the impact. I lie there for a moment that stretches, staring at sky that's obscured by smoke and hearing that's filled with ringing from the explosion. Everything hurts in ways that are both specific and general, my body cataloging injuries that are certainly serious and possibly fatal. I should stay down, should accept what's coming, should let the fortress world have its final victory. But I don't. I push myself up on the augmetic leg that still functions, while my natural leg drags uselessly, grab my las rifle with hands that are slick with blood, and resume my position at the wall. Because that's what soldiers do on fortress worlds. We fight until we can't. And then we fight a little more. The ammunition runs out during hour 30 of continuous combat. Power cells depleted, no reserves available, heavy weapons falling silent one by one as their magazines empty. We transition to hand weapons, then to improvised weapons, then to bare hands and teeth, and whatever violence we can generate from bodies that are worn past endurance. I use my combat knife until it breaks in an enemy soldier's skull. Then I use my fists until my knuckles are crushed and bleeding. Then I use my augmetic leg as a club because it's harder than flesh, and still responds to neural commands even when everything else is failing. The Fortress World's command never orders a retreat, because there's nowhere to retreat. Every section is engaged. Every fallback position is already contested, and the enemy has penetrated so deeply that the fortress interior itself has become the battlefield. The Vox network broadcasts a final message from someone claiming to be the Lord General, words about duty and sacrifice and the Emperor's eternal glory, but the transmission cuts out halfway through and nobody tries to restore it. The fortress world is dying, and everyone knows it, and official pronouncements can't change that fundamental reality. I find myself fighting alongside soldiers I don't recognize, might not even be from my regiment, possibly not even from the Fortress World's original garrison, but from some other unit that got caught in the final battle. We form a desperate circle in a courtyard that was once a mustering ground, backs together, facing outward as enemy forces close from all directions. Nobody speaks because there's nothing to say, no orders to give or follow, no tactics that can change the mathematics of our situation. We just fight until we can't, each of us buying seconds or minutes with our lives, and those seconds and minutes accumulate into nothing, into meaningless delay that serves no purpose except fulfilling the abstract requirement that the fortress world continue resisting until physically incapable of resistance. The end comes not as a dramatic moment, but as a gradual cessation. The soldier next to me falls, then another, then another. The circle contracting until it's just me standing over bodies that are still warm, facing enemies that are too numerous to count. My las rifle is gone, my knife is gone, my hands won't close into fists anymore, and blood loss is making everything distant and strange. I should feel fear or rage or something, but there's only emptiness, the same emptiness that the fortress world has been cultivating in me for months and has finally perfected. An enemy soldier approaches, weapon raised, and I recognize in his face the same exhaustion I feel, the same emptiness that comes from too much killing and too much dying and too much of everything that war entails. We look at each other across the meter of space that separates us. Two soldiers who are enemies because our commanders say so, who will kill each other because that's what soldiers do, who are both victims of systems so vast and uncaring that our individual existence means nothing except as resources to be expended. He pulls the trigger. I feel the impact of the last bolt, feel myself falling, feel the fortress world surface rising to meet me one final time. I lie on ground that's soaked with blood and other fluids, staring at sky that's obscured by smoke from 1,000 fires, and I think about the path that led me here. 19 years old in a factorum on a world I can barely remember, conscripted into service I didn't choose, transported to a fortress world whose name might be important to someone but was never important to me, transformed over months from a person into a weapon, into a corpse. This is what the Imperium does. It grinds people down into components that it uses until they break, then replaces them with fresh components and continues grinding. The fortress world is just one grinding mechanism among billions, and I'm just one component among trillions, and my death here changes nothing because change was never the point. The augmetic leg is still twitching, neural connections firing even as the organic components shut down, and I find that darkly amusing in ways I can't articulate. Even in death, the fortress world's modifications persist, the parts it added to make me more useful, continuing to function, while the parts I was born with fail. I'm becoming what the fortress world always intended me to become: more machine than human, more resource than person, more number than name. Consciousness is fading but hasn't faded completely. And in these final moments I find myself thinking about Serena, the girl from the Factorum, who smiled at me 3 times and whose face I can't quite remember anymore. I wonder if she's still alive, if she's still working the same processing station, if she thinks about me sometimes, or if I've been completely forgotten. I wonder if anyone will remember Jarek Tolvek, or if that name will just disappear into the vast archives of the Administratum, where billions of names are recorded and none are remembered. I wonder if the fortress world will continue fighting after I'm dead, or if this is finally the end. Or if endings even matter when the system that creates fortress worlds continues to function, regardless of any individual fortress world's fate. The Emperor protects, they always said, and I spent months trying to understand what that meant. Now, dying on a fortress world that's falling, I think I finally understand. The Emperor doesn't protect individuals. That was never the promise. The Emperor protects the Imperium, the vast structure of human civilization stretched across the galaxy, and that protection requires sacrifice on a scale that makes individual lives meaningless. I was sacrificed. My company was sacrificed. The fortress world's entire garrison was sacrificed. All of us ground down to buy time or territory or abstract strategic advantages that we would never see and never benefit from. And that's acceptable, according to the calculus of imperial necessity, because the alternative is letting the darkness win completely rather than just partially. I am 21 years old, and I will never be 22. I am Captain Jarek Tolvek, Service Number 8, 1, 4HU, 73291, and soon I will be just a number in a casualty report that documents the fall of a fortress world whose name I never properly learned. I am a soldier of the Imperium, and my duty is complete, not because I achieved victory, but because I have nothing left to give. The fortress world has consumed everything: my youth, my hope, my humanity, my body, and now my life, and I suppose that's fitting. That's what fortress worlds are for. That's what soldiers are for. That's what all of us are for, in the grinding machinery of eternal war. The sky is darkening, or maybe that's my vision failing, and the sounds of combat are fading into a distant roar that might be battle, or might be the ocean I heard about once but never saw. I can feel the fortress world's surface beneath me, cold ferrocrete that has absorbed the blood of millions, and I wonder if some part of me will remain here. Atomic particles scattered across the battlefield, contributing in some infinitesimal way to the planet's composition. It's a kind of immortality, I suppose, though not the glorious kind that the Commissar promised back in the mustering hall that feels like a lifetime ago. My last thought, as consciousness finally fails completely, is a simple observation that contains no emotion or judgment or meaning beyond the bare fact of its truth. This is what happens when you're posted to the edge. This is what happens to all of us, eventually. The fortress world feeds, and we are fed to it, and the feeding continues until there's nothing left to feed. World without end, Emperor eternal, Amen. And then nothing. Just darkness, and silence, and the end of a story that nobody will remember, and that makes no difference except as one more number in the vast accounting of imperial warfare. The fortress world claimed me completely, as it claimed everyone else, as it will claim everyone who comes after. That's its nature. That's its purpose. That's what we were always meant for, even if we didn't understand it until the moment of our consumption. The Emperor protects the Imperium, but the Imperium, in its infinite need and infinite hunger, protects no one, least of all us.